Thank you very much. It's the Oxford Martin School, which is a group of about 350 people working on the biggest challenges of the future. And what I'd like to share with you is some of the thinking coming out of that and why it matters for the management of the planet. We live in the most magnificent of times, what I think of as the new Renaissance, a period of extraordinary creativity, a period where lives are better, where our prospects are greater than anything our parents or grandparents could have imagined. Our average life expectancy is better. There are more people escaping poverty now than ever in history. And all the prospects are really wonderful. And yet, there's this real danger that this precious moment in history is not going to be part of a trend, but rather the end. The end of this creativity, this end of this extraordinary burst of progress which is much greater than ever in history. And that's what happened in the Renaissance. And that's why I think of this period as the new Renaissance. The Renaissance, of course, we still worship the iconic artists. We benefit from the wisdom of the Galileos and others that revolutionized thinking. But it doesn't show up in economic history at all as a time of progress. Indeed, it was a time that set us back immeasurably. We still feel the damage of the religious wars that began then. We still feel the damage inflicted by slavery and the industrialization of human subjugation that was created out of those technologies. And so the Gutenberg press, which was a revolutionary technology which allowed ideas to travel from just few people passing ideas around by word of mouth to enabling millions of people in the first years of the press to share ideas, leading to these leapfrogs in creativity that we saw in the Renaissance. That became the symbol of oppression. It became the symbol of conflict in the bonfire of the vanities, the burning of books, the destruction of the presses. And we have in our time the internet. We have connectivity at a level that could not have been imagined there, and we couldn't have even imagined 30 years ago. The walls have literally come down. The Berlin Wall fell about 24 years ago, and with that, ripples around the world, 84 countries becoming democratic, and changes that I saw in my country, South Africa, which I ascribed to the struggles of the South African people, and was certainly that. But that wouldn't have happened unless the wall came down in Berlin. The systemic change that led to our blinds being lifted. And of course, we see that continuing in the Arab Spring. We see it in China. We see it around the world today. And in the tensions that remain, not least in the setbacks in places like Egypt. So we know this is a struggle. We know that it's not a one-way street. But we think it's broadly irreversible. And yet we see in the politics of today this rejection. UKIP getting 24% of the UK vote in the most recent election. People turning their back on migration. Protectionism and nationalism rising, not only in the UK, but in many, many societies. And the tension between growing integration, our hyperconnectivity, which is the source of our progress, it's the reason for our leapfrogging, and the rejection of it, I believe, is a very great one. I believe it's the most critical tension of our time. And it's far from resolved that we are going to remain a hyper-connected, integrated global society. The fabric that binds us is under stress. And the tension is rising not because we don't want it to continue, we do. We love integration, we benefit from it, but because the institutional system which is managing it is unfit for 21st century purpose. The institutions we have are the legacy of the Second World War. They're over 60 years out of date. The United Nations system, the Bretton Woods system, and other parts of it which arose in the Cold War. And so the new challenges are not being met by an institutional response. At the national level, the response is to use our old sovereign state to try and manage an economy, a society, technologies which are global. And at the global level, we try and use these unwieldy fossilized institutions to try and manage global affairs. With old civil servants created with job descriptions for different periods of time. And the irony is that our successes, not only in the economic terrain, but in the political terrain, are making this much more difficult. It's because we are climbing this economic curve so rapidly. It's because 5 billion people around the world are escaping poverty and climbing the energy ladder incredibly rapidly, the food ladder, the land and water ladder so rapidly, that we have this very rapidly rising perfect storm. And we saw this reinforced in the IPCC materials coming out yesterday. It's because of our success in interconnectivity, our success in growth, our collective genius being unlocked to create development, that we have this rising tension. But it's also because of our political success, because we have won our freedoms, because we have more individual right. We have the ability to choose in ways that were unimaginable for most of the world only 30 years ago. There's only really one society now, North Korea, which is disconnected, where people are not part of this global community, compared to well over 80% of the world's population only 30 years ago. But because we have more choice, we also make more crazy decisions. Decisions which are rational for us as individuals, but not rational for the collective, not rational for the planet or for the future of the world. And this tension between individual rationality and collective rationality, I believe, is absolutely at the center. Now, this is not a new idea either. The idea of global commons and global commons management and the tension around it is an old one. Economists have written about the tragedy of the commons. When villagers had a few goats and cattle and put them on the common fields, that was fine, the fields sustained them. But as they got wealthier and got more and more goats or cattle, the pastures collapsed. And so it was when a small number of people fished in the rivers or lakes, and then the lakes and rivers became depleted. And so rules were put in place. Elders were created that managed these common resources. There were regulations. There were times. There were numbers of cattle you could put on. Now, we've seen in many signals, like in the ocean fisheries, the collapse of these global commons, but they're becoming increasingly stark. A tuna was sold for $1.8 million in Tokyo in January this year, and there's a great YouTube video of this auction. That's about $10,000 for a plate of sushi. And we see similarly absurd prices for rhinoceros horn and for many, many other scarce natural resources. Of course, the tuna or rhinoceros don't know how much they're worth. They don't mate more when they become million-dollar creatures. Their supply is determined by their old habits. And so we see extinction looming in these areas because people are exercising their rational choices. But when you sum this up in other areas, it becomes even more dramatic. It's not just the tuna or the rhinos that are going, it's our atmosphere. It's of course rational for everyone to progress from not having energy up the energy ladder, to get air conditioning, heating, cooking, computing, TVs, transport, and all of that. I'm amazed by the number of attendees that have come here from Sydney, or speakers. That's rational. We all want to hear them. They want to come. That's our individual choice. We all do it all the time. I travel more than the average. And yet we know that when these rational individual actions sum up, we will get disastrous global consequences. So what is to be done? I believe it's absolutely crucial that we accept a loss of individual and national sovereignty. Whatever can be decided at lower level as possible by individuals, by communities, by countries, should be. But where the spillover effects of our decisions impact on others, it's very important that we collectively understand that. And that, of course, not only requires an understanding, but an action around it. This is different to choices around something like religion. If you're religious, you believe that non-believers might go to hell. that's fine, but actually it's only you in the end that is living through the consequences of your beliefs. The choices we exercise around us in our consumption of goods and services, in our lifestyles, impact everywhere. Now, as Malik said in the previous presentation, the UK in many ways might be better off. Northern Europe might be better off. Northern Canada might be better off as a result of climate change. And so maybe selfishly we'd think, well, it'd be great to be able to predict a barbecue. Let's not worry too much about climate change. But of course, as a global community, we know that billions of people will be made much worse off as a result. And we know that the planet will become less sustainable. And it's not just climate change. We need to think about this writ large. Antibiotic resistance is another very good example of the tension between individual and collective rationality. It's rational for all of us to take antibiotics, to give them to our loved ones. We'd be silly not to in many ways. And yet we know that in all of us doing that, they're becoming less and less effective. And this is compounded by the problem that actually most antibiotics are no longer given to humans, they're given to animals, to increase the profitability of food processing. They're even painted on ships' hulls to speed up the movement of ships so that the barnacles don't grow on them, so our goods and services have fractions of logistics costs shaved off them, and the companies can do even better. This is insane, because we also know that one of the consequences of being joined up and being more people, and there are 2 billion more people in the world since 1990, since these walls have come down, an extraordinary success story because they're escaping poverty, and that's never happened before with more people and far fewer poor people. But we also know that as we're more densely packed in urban areas and more connected, that pandemics will be a much greater threat to humanity. Our Future of Emerging Infections group in the Oxford Martin School has demonstrated how pandemics will exactly mirror airline traffic and how places like Heathrow, JFK, and others will be the super spreaders of new pandemics. We know this. This is not complicated. But our actions are making it much more difficult for us to resist. In the financial crisis, we saw the first of the 21st century systemic crises. A cascading failure that came out of a complete conceptual failure of economists to understand what they were doing. The prizing of individual rationality, the putting it in such a place that it was regarded as the logical expression of a collective rationality. If people pumped it up, it must be happening because it's logically so, what economists call rational expectations theory. And what we saw was as this market pumped up, the politics behind it drove it even further. No one wanted to prick the balloon. Taking away the punch bowl while the party's going is not a nice thing for a politician to do. And so what we saw was this facade of wealth creation being sustained in a totally unsustainable base. And of course, when it came to an end, it did not only impact on those that were immediately affected, the homeowners who had their homes repossessed, but shocked around the world. So all of us and our friends and our labor markets are much worse off, and up to 100 million people have been laid off around the world as a result of this misguided belief in individual rationality in economic markets. But it wasn't only an intellectual failure around the markets, it was a technological blind spot. Hank Paulson, who was the Treasury Secretary of the US at the time, had been the chief executive of Goldman Sachs. And in his testimony to the Congress, in explaining why they let Lehman Brothers go, and Lehman became the center of the spider web of financial transactions that led to this cascading failure, he and others say, we simply did not know what was happening. Now, cynics may say he was bluffing. Of course, he knew, I actually believe that he and the whole supervision system, which is the most sophisticated global system in the world with the best data, the best people, and the most joined up, actually didn't know what was going on. They were blind. They were blind to the structural changes, to the technological changes, with how these derivatives were evolving, and to the complexity of the system and its super spreading around the world. They did not understand complexity, they did not understand hyperconnectivity, and they did not understand technological change. They were misguided in believing it was rational. They were misguided in believing that it would look after itself. And of course, in the UK, our leadership similarly brought down regulation when they should have been lifting it, became less connected when they should have been becoming more connected. But under it was a deep intellectual failure and a deep failure to understand the way the world is evolving. And so I see in the financial crisis, the first of the systemic crises, but certainly not the last. And I think many others in cyberspace, in pandemics, in climate, will follow these similar patterns, with this complete failure to recognize the spillover or unintended consequences of what might seem politically expedient national decisions. Political expedient decisions for individuals. After all, because we're more democratic, we vote for the people that make these decisions. We put in place this governance system, which is leading to an unbundling of governance. And so this paradox, we live in a world where hyperconnectivity and integration defines our time. In many aspects of our lives, we feel it all the time, not least in walking around Shoreditch and feeling the vibrancy of this multicultural environment. In our technologies that we use, in everything we think about. And this is leading to a release of genius, individual genius, because there's just so much more creativity. There's so many more educated people out there, so much more talent being connected. And collective genius, because not only about the individuals at the top end of the spectrum, it's about our ability to come together, and through our coming together, to have ideas we could never have had on our own. And we know this from all the psychological management and other work that's done on creativity. We know that when we come together, we can do things we can't do on our own. And yet the perverse outcome of this is that we're coming together to create bigger and bigger problems for ourselves. This is the best time to be alive. So it's not based on a pessimism about where we're at. It's based on extraordinary optimism. Just while you're listening to me for 20 minutes, your average life expectancy will increase by about 5 minutes. This is the most amazing time. But we need to recognize that it's fragile, that this time cannot be sustained unless we think differently about the implications of why we're here and where we go if we carry on like this. And it's not just about us, because we, with our incomes, can turn up the air conditioning or turn up the heating and insulate ourselves. Maybe we can even stockpile pandemic drugs or anti-pandemic drugs that might protect us, although their efficacy will be coming down. It's about what we think about of ourselves as human beings. Do we care what the spillover impacts of our actions are, and what do we do about it? This group here at Future Fest, I believe, is an extraordinary opportunity. All of us will be living all of the rest of our lives in the future, but it's remarkable how little time people spend consciously thinking about what does the future hold and what can we do about it. This is a fantastic opportunity to do so, and I hope in the 19 minutes I've had with you that this has been helpful in the way you think about it. Thank you.